This is LBC.
With Vauxhall, energising a better Britain.
Let joy be unconfined. Simon Marks is here. I always feel a strange disturbance in the force, Simon, when I haven't spoken to you for a while. But similarly, there's a little bit of Groundhog Day to the first thing that we're going to talk about. When is a ceasefire not a ceasefire? When they carry on bombing. But when is an attack not an attack? When it gets called off at the last minute. And that's what happened yesterday.
Yes, when is an attack that had never been previously disclosed to the American public or to the wider world not an attack when it gets called off at the last minute? I mean, that, James, is exactly what President Trump did yesterday, raising a whole raft of questions. The sudden posting of his claim on Truth Social that the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE had placed the arm on him and said, please don't go ahead with the planned attack that he says he was about to unleash on Iran over the course of the next few hours today, raises enormous questions about the president's own capacity to try and find an off-ramp from this conflict, and not only find an off-ramp, but exploit it properly so that he can actually bring the conflict to an end with the really detailed, boring, time-consuming negotiations that is going to require. But it also raises a raft of other questions. I mean, this war on Iran, we now know, was greenlit by the president because the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said to the Americans, I'm going to attack Iran in the early hours of March the 1st. And whether you're with me or not, I'm going in. And the Americans then, and this is in the Secretary of State's telling, the Americans then said, well, they were going to go in with the Israelis because they were concerned that if the Israelis launched a strike on Iran on their own, reprisals for that set of airstrikes would inevitably target US military assets in the region, and they thought that if we're going to do this, we better do it properly. So they went in because it was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who was putting the arm on President Trump. Now, multiple weeks later, it's the Saudis, the Qataris and the Emiratis who are putting the arm on President Trump and saying, no, still your military. Do not send them in again. We think the negotiation track is showing signs of progress. He remains itching in the traps to unleash the military. He said in that Truth Social posting, he's told the man he calls the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, to be locked and loaded and ready to go in if the negotiations once again fall apart. But, you know, in any other era, with any other American president, questions would be being asked about who is actually the commander-in-chief here? Is it Benjamin Netanyahu? Is it Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Is it the leaders of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar? Who is in charge here? And what is the outlook for a conflict that by the day is becoming increasingly unpopular with the American public? 64% of the public now, in the New York Times Siena College poll that was published yesterday, disapprove of President Trump's decision to go to war. Never mind disapprove of the actual carrying out of this. They disapprove of his initial decision to go to war. And that's a staggering number.
Indeed it is. Forgive me, should we be speaking quite so confidently about this actually being true? That it is the leaders of Qatar?
No.
So right, because he could have just been making... Because he's sitting there desperately trying to save face, and this is what he's come up with today. I mean, that could be the case.
Well, it's a classic... Yeah, it's a classic Tucko move, right?
Yeah,
it's a classic Trump always chickens out move, although given that he hadn't announced that he was planning to launch the attack, I mean... He'd intimated that, you know, that they were going to go in hotter and heavier than ever before against the Iranians, but he hadn't set a specific time limit for it. So certainly odd that suddenly we were reading tomorrow night's planned attack. I mean, who knew there was an attack tomorrow night planned, unless, of course, there's a WhatsApp group somewhere and a journalist here in Washington, you know, buried in the corner of it, observing communications between administration officials, which we also should not rule out on the basis of past form. But what that Truth Social posting demonstrated is that he's not the master of his own destiny, which is an extraordinary thing to concede, but also that he is definitely still desperate to bring this to an end, but flailing around in his efforts to try and do so.
On that point about not knowing what's true and what isn't true, the media in the States has reported US intelligence leaks that Iran has got or maintained about 70% of its missiles, 75% of its rocket launchers. So Donald Trump then has to come out and say fake news. That's not true. And the average punter or the average observer or the average journalist, there's nothing average about you, Simon, just has to toss a coin. I mean, you're probably going to trust the intelligence leaks more than you're going to trust the President of the United States of America.
Well, you almost don't even have to toss a coin, because a couple of weeks before, 3 weeks, I think, before those reports were published here, we learnt that in classified briefings on Capitol Hill, senior figures from the Department of Defense had told lawmakers that Iran still had at its disposal thousands of ballistic missiles and drones capable of posing a significant threat to the US and allied militaries, partner militaries in the region. And those leaks, it is presumed, came from lawmakers on Capitol Hill who had actually heard the classified briefings and wanted to make it clear that the story that was being told by the administration behind closed doors on Capitol Hill was totally at odds with the claims that have been made relentlessly by President Trump and Pete Hegseth about the Iranian military being obliterated. They've got no more missile launchers left. That, according to the latest reporting, is absolutely untrue. They've got no anti-aircraft capacity. You know, they were a military completely on its knees. That is not what lawmakers were told last month, and it's not what these new claims that have been published here over the last few days are maintaining.
And of course, you then have that you've talked to us before about the late night Truth Social brain dumps, where perhaps we get closer to the truth of what's going on in his addled noggin than we do at any other time. And I'm going to get this verbatim because otherwise people won't believe it actually happened. If Iran surrenders, admits their navy is gone and resting at the bottom of the sea, and their air force is no longer with us, and if their entire military walks out of Tehran, weapons dropped and hands held high, each shouting, I surrender, while wildly waving the representative white flag, and admit their defeat to the great power and force of the magnificent USA, the failing New York Times, the China Street Journal, which is what he calls the Wall Street Journal, corrupt and now irrelevant CNN, and all other members of the fake news media will headline that Iran had a masterful and brilliant victory over the United States of America. It wasn't even close. We've speculated plenty on his mental state, and we don't need to speculate again, but that was actually written in public by the President of the United States of America. Which brings us to, again, the tension between the sort of unhinged, deranged spoutings and then the hideously corrupt, probably, actions, because we're now looking at an almost $2 billion fund being set up, quite possibly, to reward people who committed crimes on January the 6th, 2021.
Yeah, I want to make one tiny point about the press, because I think it's important.
Yes, of course.
It goes beyond what he did on Truth Social. On Air Force One, on his way back from China, he directly accused David Sanger of the New York Times, the dean of the diplomatic foreign policy press corps in this city, a man with unparalleled experience of covering successive presidential administrations. He accused him of treason for daring to question how things were actually going in Iran. That's another staggering Rubicon crossed. On this fund, $1.776 billion, and that number is, of course, not coincidental, 1776. This is the 250th year of America's independence from the UK.
I think a lot of British journalists have missed that, because they've all gone with the 1.8 billion headline, but that's why we pay you the big bucks, Simon.
$1.776 billion being set aside to compensate, according to acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, man who's never been Senate approved to be Attorney General. It's going to be paid to victims of lawfare that were on the receiving end of what they claim were unfair investigations and prosecutions by the Biden administration. All of this, the way this played out is that, as we've discussed before, Donald Trump launched a ludicrous $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS for leaking, he claimed, his tax records to the media. The judge in the case was about to throw it out, was saying to President Trump, you can't sue the government that you are leading for $10 billion because that's double dealing. And, you know, the idea that the arm is being placed on the Department of Justice to settle a lawsuit from which you, the President of the United States, would personally gain is ludicrous. I'm going to chuck this out. So knowing that this case was going to be dismissed, or at least assuming that it was, what the president decided to do was to say, right, if I'm not going to get any money, I'm going to make sure that all my mates do. So he's ordered the creation of this fund, which will face legal challenges, which the Department of Justice says the Trump family will not personally benefit from it. They're simply going to receive an apology from the IRS. But the idea is that all of those guys that were jailed for leading a violent, deadly insurrection on Capitol Hill on President Trump's behalf on January the 6th, 2021, they may all be in line for payouts from this. All sorts of individuals who claim they were the victims of lawfare, whatever that is, are in line to be paid out from this. And this is an opportunity that the president is seizing to take public money, funnel it to his supporters, many of them prominent political backers of his, and to do that $1.776 billion at a time when Americans going to petrol station forecourts all over the country today are struggling to keep their cars, their trucks and farm vehicles filled with fuel because of the soaring prices at the pumps directly resulting from his war on Iran.
On we go. Very briefly, if you would, Simon. Paul's been in touch. He goes, ask Simon about Thomas Massey.
It's a huge night tonight in Kentucky. We don't often dwell on Republican Party primary elections in Kentucky, but Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky, a persistent thorn in Donald Trump's side, considered a traitor, could, by tomorrow morning, have essentially been deselected by Republicans in Kentucky on the orders of President Donald Trump. This is a fresh test of Donald Trump's grip over the Republican Party. Last weekend, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana became the first sitting senator of either party to be defenestrated by his own party, and that was on Donald Trump's orders. So huge juice being exercised by Donald Trump over the weekend in getting rid of Bill Cassidy. Now he wants to see Kentucky Republicans doing exactly the same with Thomas Massey, a man who is relentlessly focused, to the great irritation of the White House, on getting to the bottom of the Jeffrey Epstein affair.
Indeedy, which everybody on Trump's side was deeply focused on not long ago, but we are where we are. Simon Marks, brilliant stuff, as always.